Okay, hi guys, welcome back. Kieran here again from the Dublin Academy. So just continuing on this series of classes on the poetry of Adrienne Rich. So I hope you got on okay with Storm Warnings. As I said, it's about the metaphor really and the imagery that's in there that's sort of capturing the interior and the exterior world. So again, trying to break this down for yourself into digestible, I suppose bite-sized chunks of like things really, okay, what am I going to really zero in on this poem? So again, I'm cautioning against trying to regurgitate everything that I've said or try to, and this is what you want to absolutely avoid in the exam, is just summarizing the poem. That's not the task. What you want to do is kind of take out of that poem what really speaks to you, try and make a point about the pattern, the imagery, the sensuousness, suggestion, always keeping those to the forefront of our minds. That helps us organize our ideas. And again, trying to take out 3 or 4 little quotations, little lines there that sort of resonate with us, again, based maybe on my suggestions or possibly another line that you particularly like in the poem that works for you. So in today's lesson, I'm going to talk about Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, and then I'm going to talk about Living in Sin. So again, as I say, trying to consider these poems not necessarily in pairs, but think about the connections between them. Both of these poems, as you'll see, concern relationships. Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, more specifically marriage, but Living in Sin, also a relationship between a man and a woman, but as the title would suggest, not married. So I'll talk about that when we get to that in a little while. So again, same thing, I'm just going to move down through the poem. So we're on page 84 here in the notes for Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. And you'll see immediately looking at it on the page, it's a nice little poem. Again, very conventional in structure. We have these 3 4-line stanzas. So again, this is very much a poem from the early years, I suppose, of Rich's poetry. And in fact, she was only 21 when this poem was published. I suppose one thing to mention about this, again, just in case there's any sense of, this is a personal poem, whatever, the Aunt Jennifer character in the poem and the husband, the uncle character in the poem are fictional. So it's not representing anybody in particular, but it's rather a way of Rich for exploring the dynamics within a marriage and probably reflecting the dynamics within a marriage from the era in which she was growing up. Could be a reflection of her own parents' marriage, we don't know, that would be speculative, but what we do know is that it echoes or reflects a particular viewpoint that was starting to emerge, a sense that she was having about marriage, and particularly about marriage inequality. So again, I mentioned the themes and so on the other day, so this particular theme of the inequality between men and women. So Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, it has a very feminist quality to it, as I mentioned, conventional structure, and really to do with gender inequality, marriage, the imbalance within marriage, very contemporary themes as well, despite the era in which it was written. So, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the trees, they pace in sleek chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. And you probably notice, excuse me, even in the reading of that, the regular rhythm and the regular rhyme scheme. So when I talk about formality within poetry, I talk about conventional structures, that is a good example of that. So it actually lends the poem this almost musical, slightly upbeat quality when we read it, which is actually quite ironic because the subject matter itself and the depiction of the relationship within it, as you can probably already discern even from the first reading, is quite grim and quite unpleasant and so on, threatening. However, at the center of this poem too is the contrast between what Aunt Jennifer is creating, this presumably embroidery of some description or some sort of a print of these, well, it could be a print, she's using a needle, so it's some sort of an embroidered, some sort of a created piece depicting these tigers, which are energetic and fearless, and very much the opposite to Aunt Jennifer herself. So in some ways, and again what we can start to see emerging here is this this exploration of the art and the artist, this exploration of what the person creating the piece maybe is like, and then how the art reflects or does not reflect them. And art, and again, thinking about Rich herself, thinking about Rich trying to break into a world, male-dominated world really, of poetry and trying to sort of find her own voice within that world. We can see the kind of the connection there as well between this idea. So it's kind of a sub-theme here. But really to the fore of this poem is this exploration of the man and the woman and the marriage and the relationship between them. So, as we move down through it, let's take a look at the first stanza. And Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz. Topaz is a kind of a yellowish colour, you know, again, the colour one would expect a tiger to be. There's nothing unusual about these tigers. Denizen is just another word really for an inhabitant. Yeah, think about the word citizen, kind of has a similar root of a world of green. So what we get here is very vivid imagery of the yellow, the green, these bright, energetic colours. You see, even she mentions the word bright, we see the word prance, again, an energetic verb, and when we connect that to the last line in that stanza, the pacing and the sleek, chivalric certainty, a nice little kind of musicality within that. The words themselves seem to bounce, a great example of alliteration at play, and even though it's an S followed by two C's, there's a soft C, so there's a nice kind of musicality to those lines. So this is all cumulatively sort of suggesting the energy of the tigers within this depiction. And they pace. Sleek means that they're sort of streamlined, or in some way that they're it's reflecting their physical appearance. Again, the imagery. Chivalric is an interesting choice of word, because chivalry, as you may remember from your junior cert history, this idea when you studied feudal system, knights and so on, it's something we associate with knighthood, with honour, with being a gentleman. But it does have sort of strong connotations here around how men behave with women. And again, so there could be, again, suggestion, there could be a little bit of an ironic sort of commentary here on the uncle and how he mistreats maybe his wife, or certainly, again, what that is strongly suggested, and how the tigers stand in contrast to that. They are confident, they're full of energy, they're full of life, and all of that imagery in there really captures that. So the other thing worth mentioning here is not only how the tigers contrast with the uncle, but how they contrast with Aunt Jennifer herself. So it's just worth noting the depiction of them and how that's captured in those verbs. And when we move into the second stanza, it focuses very much on the character of Aunt Jennifer. And one of the first things that we notice there is the alliteration on her fingers fluttering through her wool. And what this suggests to us again is nerves, is that this woman is a nervous character, that her fingers flutter, and when that's reinforced in the second line of this stanza, finding even the ivory needle hard to pull. So the suggestion, the strong impression that's emerging of this aunt, this character, is of somebody timid, somebody who's quite weak, vulnerable, frail, and afraid. So quite a number of different words there that we could be looking at. And now, when we talk about quotation from poetry, this third line in this second stanza, make sure you highlight this: the massive weight of Uncle's wedding band, and even follow it on, if you can remember the whole thing, sits heavily upon Jennifer's hand. This is really where the metaphor becomes most significant, because the idea of, and look at that, the words massive, particularly, and then obviously weight. So there's actually here a word which you can use, this is subversion here. So we came across this word subversive when we dealt with Paul Durkin, particularly renowned as a subversive poet. Here, the subversion is sort of, it's where you're sort of commenting on or rebelling against something maybe in a slightly more passive way or in an unexpected way. And here we see a subversion of the ideas, the traditional ideas of marriage, because the wedding band as a symbol is supposed to symbolize eternal love, no beginning, no end, so hence the ring. But here, it moves away from that and becomes instead a massive weight. And that image of the massive weight of the wedding band connects very much with, in the final stanza, the second line, how Aunt Jennifer, even after she is dead, is ringed with ordeals. So what we want to note here is the negative language that is associated with the marriage, the negative language that's associated with the relationship that these two characters have. So the idea of the weight as well, think about expressions like the weight of the world on your shoulders. So we see here maybe as a suggestion of dominance, or not merely a suggestion, in fact it's pretty clear, the idea that Aunt Jennifer is in some way weighed down by this particular relationship. So make sure you take those lines. And the third stanza, again, an interesting departure in this poem, because what Rich does is jumps forward here to when Aunt Jennifer has died. So even after death, when Aunt is dead, her terrified hands, and again highlight that, her terrified hands will lie still, and as I mentioned already, ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. And words you want to be zeroing in on here are terrified, ordeals, and mastered by. So again, the mastered by suggesting the dominance. The idea of marriage being an ordeal. The idea of her hands, even after death, that she is still terrified. And terrified as a word is it's not necessarily hyperbolic here, exaggerating, but it is certainly, it's a big word, it's a superlative. So when we see the idea of someone being terrified is that they're more than just a little afraid, even in death. So what does that suggest about the dynamic in this relationship between the aunt and uncle? I think it's fairly clear. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. Now, this is again where this idea, this sub-theme maybe of the art and the artist. The art as a reflection of the artist is very much at play. Because despite Aunt Jennifer's presumably unhappy marriage and life, marriage being an ordeal for her, the fact that even in death she still seems terrified, the fact that her fingers flutter when she is alive and trying to create this, the piece of art that she created, which outlives her, is actually, and again, stands very much firstly in stark contrast to her, so note that again in those lines. But look at the active verb there, prancing in the final line, and then the description, proud and unafraid. So despite the fact that Aunt Jennifer herself lived a particular kind of life, presumably largely based on the marriage that this fictional character again had, what she created, these tigers go on proud and unafraid. These tigers, this piece of art that she created that represents another part of her personality. And that's really the idea with art and the artist, is that art is a way of expressing ourselves. So art is a way maybe of breaking free, and this is something we see in a later poem of Rich's as well. And we can start to understand a little bit about what's fueling this from her own personal perspective. The idea that you create something that's maybe representing another aspect of your personality that for whatever reason was kind of dominated. So, as I said, this poem again, a lot of suggestion here, a lot of, always remembering that this character, Jennifer and the uncle, are fictional, they are creations, but it's to kind of make this point, to explore this overall theme, the inequality within marriage, and then the idea of the art outliving the artist, and the art representing maybe some. And again, another good word to use here is this idea of repression, some repressed element of a character's personality, or of any person's personality. So again, all those main ideas and so on, just synopsized on page 85. So that is Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. So we will just again, as I go back down through it, on page 86 there you have your pattern imagery, sensuous suggestiveness boxes, so put in a couple of points there for yourself and try and pick out, again, 3 or 4 of those little quotes if you can. In this one, because again, that poem is very economic in terms of the materials in there. Individual words are good, like I said, words that capture the energy of the tigers, words that capture the idea of the fear that Aunt Jennifer feels. Now, the uncle speaks in the drawing room is next, but we're going to skip over that just for today, because what I want to look at, and you'll see the connection here, is Living in Sin on page 90. So if you could just skip forward to that. And again, I think first thing to mention about this poem, Living in Sin, is that it was published in 1955. So what that means is that you're kind of in the throes of sort of a more conservative era, let's say in America, traditionally. And the title itself is, it's important, I suppose, to realize that that's the era from which this poem is emerging, because the title is an expression probably not many of you or any of you are familiar with, but this idea of living in sin is a kind of an old religious expression to refer to a couple who were living together but were not married, and this idea that that was in some way a sin. And this would have been in more common use in the 1950s, certainly, and certainly an idea that Rich would have been very much exposed to. So There's an element here of, I suppose, echoing the reflective, the conservative society, but also maybe something kind of ironic about it too, because it is a depiction of a couple who are living together unmarried. Now, is it Rich herself? It doesn't appear so. Again, the evidence wouldn't necessarily suggest so. So again, I'd steer away from that a little bit. And just note again that even the way this poem is written, it is in the third person. So it's very much about somebody else. So it's kind of, another exploration of a relationship, whether real or imaginary. Let's go on the basis that, again, this too is fictional, possibly echoing some experiences that Rich had. But again, kind of like Aunt Jennifer, it's very much just about the exploration of the theme and the imbalance. This is another poem now this is one you should start to note the change in her forms. When I talk about the various styles that she employs, this one is written in free verse, and it actually has a narrative quality to it. And in fact, the poem itself reads almost like a day in the life of. It begins sort of at dawn and sort of moves through sort of the day to some extent, and then back to sort of the oncoming dawn of the following day. So it kind of has this slightly narrative sort of passage of time quality to it. So, as I mentioned, the third person narrator, the voice in the poem is significant. She had thought the studio would keep itself, no dust upon the furniture of love. Half heresy to wish the taps less vocal, the panes relieved of grime. A plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl, a cat stalking the picturesque, amusing mouse had risen at his urging. Not that at 5 each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp. That morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese, and 3 sepulchral bottles that on the kitchen shelf among the saucers a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own, envoy from some village in the Moldings. Meanwhile, he with a yawn sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard, declared it out of tune, shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, went out for cigarettes. While she, jeered by the minor demons, pulled back the sheets and made the bed, and found a towel to dust the tabletop, and let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. By evening, she was back in love again, though not so wholly. But throughout the night, she woke sometimes to feel the daylight coming like a relentless milkman up the stairs. So,
as I said, first thing to note about this poem is the title, and just there are religious, now connotations, good word to use, again another word we can use when we're talking about suggestion, that there's some connotation, there's some connection or some association with that idea. So the idea of living in sin, and we also see this echoed in the third line with the word heresy. So breaking it down, as I said, first thing, third person narrative. Rich steps outside the poem here, and she kind of comments really on the expectations of this character. And that is something that should be emerging in the opening lines, is the idea of expectation. She had thought that the studio, that's a studio apartment, like a small cramped space, I suppose, really, that this studio would keep itself. So it's really about the way she is naive and the way that she sort of idealized, and that's another word, this idealizing this experience, idealistic, that everything would be perfect, that once they were together, living together in this apartment, so everything would be great, that it would be half heresy, again, like this idea of heresy being like a religious crime, to wish the taps less vocal, the pains relieved of grime. So two things are happening in that imagery. First of all, we're getting a sense of a studio apartment that's maybe a little bit run down, and certainly, so we're like the taps are dripping, that there's grime. So it's less, so again, it's this contrast between expectation and reality. And the imagery there of the domestic life, and it's reinforced a little later on in this part of the poem as well, is of a fairly grim setting, and a lot of negative imagery emerging here. The focus in the fourth line shifts to the art, so presumably the man that she's living in with is an artist. We're told a plate of pears, a piano with the Persian shawl, a cat stalking the picturesque mouse had risen at his urging. Now, these are references presumably to artwork that he's created. The idea of them has risen at his urging, that he, as an artist in some way, created these. Is there potentially a religious sort of a suggestion there, the idea of something rising at the urgency? Possibly, maybe reading a little bit more too deeply into it. But yeah, again, it kind of jumps out of this. It's an interesting way of phrasing that, but it certainly does imply and suggest the idea of a creator. There's potentially a little bit of a mocking tone here. The alliteration on the P is very noticeable. Does it suggest maybe a little bit of contempt? There can sometimes, when we, with the P sound, it's a slightly spitting, a plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl. There's an almost spitting quality here. Is there a little bit of frustration or contempt creeping in here as Rich explores those images? It certainly would appear so. So it's almost scene setting in that first part of the poem, and there's a shift then, not that at 5 each morning, into sort of the present. So this idea that, first of all, we get the image of the woman lying awake at dawn, lying awake before the milkman has even arrived to deliver the milk. And that suggests that things are not right, because if she's lying awake at dawn, sleeplessness, always suggesting that something is wrong. And that is very much reinforced with the word writhe. So take note of that word to writhe, to wriggle, to squirm, this idea of something which is maybe being contained again, but it's a very unpleasant sounding word, but it's a desire to escape. Now it's specifically referencing the milkman on the stairs, but again, there's a little bit of sort of metaphor maybe happening here, that the milkman's step on the stairs seem to writhe underneath, but it's more transference, it's more about the emotional state of the poet. That morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese. Take a note of that line. Again, the idea here of this is more subversion, like I mentioned with Aunt Jennifer's Tiger. So again, this idea of subverting the idea, to subvert the idea of sort of the lovers at dawn. You know, traditionally within poetry, dawn is kind of the dawning of the new day, the idea of a rebirth, a new beginning. You know, symbolically, it's traditionally quite significant within poetry. But here we see the opposite happening. We see a subversion of that idea, and instead we see dawn. The key word there is coldly. To delineate means to kind of outline. So this idea that she's lying there, watch as the sun as it begins to rise, or as the light in the apartment begins to brighten, and she can start to delineate and make out and see the shapes of last night's. She says scraps of cheese and the 3 sepulchral bottles, and even that word sepulchral, this idea that they're some way monuments or something like this, that they kind of those shapes start to emerge as the morning light brightens. But really the effect, the cumulative effect here, is of a woman who is having trouble sleeping and is awake so early. And all of this domestic imagery is grim, again, just to reinforce that. You know, the idea that the apartment is untidy, that they haven't cleaned up from the night before. And then this reference to the beetle eyes. And there's almost a little dark humor creeping in here. She says a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own. Envoy, that word is like, basically the best substitute is like an ambassador. You know, that he sort of comes, as she says, from some village. The moldings kind of I suppose an Americanization really for what we might call the skirting board or architrave or something. This idea that the beetle has crawled out from the moldings, that he's sort of, an envoy, like an ambassador, like a little messenger. So almost like there's a weird little connection between the character in this poem and the beetle himself. But again, it's not a particularly pleasant image that emerges. Look at the ellipsis here. We talk about pattern and how a poem is created. The ellipsis, that's the 3 dots. So again, with an ellipsis, there's always a suggestion of continuity, something ongoing. So the effect here is that this sort of scenario plays out again and again. Then we shift the focus, and Rich shifts the focus here onto the imagery of the boyfriend. Meanwhile, he with the yawn. So again, it's very much the she and the he. So these are kind of generic characters. They're not really necessarily meant to be representing specific people, even though the scenario seems quite specific. So he with a yawn sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard, declared it out of tune, shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, went out for cigarettes. So this is the imagery that surrounds this boyfriend. So what do we see? Well, certainly somebody who's laid back, somebody who seems a little bit casual, somebody who doesn't seem particularly bothered by things. Maybe something significant to note here is the declaring the keyboard out of tune, because the idea that it's out of tune may suggest some quality about the relationship as well, that these 2 characters are somehow out of tune with one another. There's no harmony, that in some way there's a fundamental problem within the relationship. So the semicolon then at the end of cigarettes as the focus shifts, and again we see the contrast here between this somehow laid back kind of, artist type boyfriend who's, just kind of commenting on things in the apartment and then goes out for cigarettes. We see the woman then who's left behind, jeered by minor demons. Take a note of that line. That is when to jeer means to make fun of. The minor demons, kind of the voices in her head, if you like, not in any sinister or sort of way where we're kind of imagining there's anything wrong here. It's rather just kind of the voices almost of herself, of her true personality, kind of going, this isn't what you expected. Almost mocking her in a sense. So the unhappiness comes across very clearly here. And look at as well what she does after he leaves. Pull back the sheets and made the bed and found a towel to dust the tabletop and let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. And what we see here is really one of the central points of the poem is the woman falling back into the traditional roles of homemaker, the traditional role of sort of taking care of the apartment and so on. It's echoing back to the second line about no dust on the furniture of love. Here she's using a tea towel or looking for a tea towel to kind of wipe things down. Again, even the idea of the coffee pot boiling over is suggestive that the place was a bit of a mess anyway. But really what we notice is the man kind of does his thing and the woman ends up kind of falling back into that traditional role, and the contrast between those very, very important and certainly crucial in terms of understanding part of Rich's message within this poem. And as the poem moves into its final sentence, essentially, because it is a sentence, but by evening it's like the final movement in the poem, almost the conclusion of the narrative. So we're moving kind of back to, so it's moving from dawn kind of through the day and now the evening time. And again, definitely take note of this line: by evening she was back in love again, though not so wholly. The suggestion is that this was a sort of a gradually decreasing experience for her, that like the love was diminishing, that she began sort of naive, idealistic maybe about how things were going to be, found herself falling into these traditional roles. And although by evening she'd kind of gotten over that and she was back in love again, the caveat there, the condition, the fact that it was, not so holy, again, strongly suggests that this relationship has an expiration date. Because, and again, the final image here, throughout the night, she woke sometimes, and again, highlight these lines, to feel the daylight coming like a relentless milkman up the stairs. So again, echoing back to the earlier image of the milkman, the writhing step, and here we have the relentless milkman. And that word relentless is critical in here because, again, it's echoing to the idea of the not so holy, that this relationship is coming to an end. That one way or another, this relationship, this is not going to work. The woman is unhappy, she's jeered by the demons, she's fallen into this traditional role that she doesn't really want to occupy, and the milkman is coming. So the milkman almost becomes a metaphor here for this onset, something foreboding. So there are even echoes here of storm warnings as well, of sometimes, and again, the overarching theme, the idea that of powerlessness, of lack of control, that Bishop felt that some things are maybe greater than us. So again, I think that's just that sense of inevitability, and that, a good way to phrase that actually is this suggestion that her love is waning, W-A-N-I-N-G, that it is decreasing, that it is gradually kind of moving aside, and the milkman, again, the metaphor of the milkman, the relentlessness, reality coming up the stairs, if you like to kind of consider it that way. So that is Living in Sin. So as I said again, think about your P, your I, your S, and your S, and go to page 92. Take out again 3 or 4 of the individual lines and complete that. And I will see you for the next lesson when we look at our next 2 poems, which are Trying to Talk with a Man and From a Survivor. See you then.